Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday, kicking off Sky News' live coverage of COP26 here in Glasgow. Boris Johnson, usually the life and soul of the party, told world leaders gathering in Rome yesterday that in the fight against man-made climate change, humanity is 5-1 down, and it isn't even half-time yet. His gloom may be down to the absence of some star players. China and Russia's leaders haven't made it to the game this week. And some other fossil fuel stars, Australia, Saudi Arabia amongst them, don't look as though they'll deliver their net zero goals until 2060. In short, it's 7 years since the governments who jubilantly signed the Paris Accord agreed to try to halt the rise in global temperature. Yet today we are no closer to that objective. Can Glasgow pull the irons out of the fire? We'll see what our guests hope for this morning. In a moment, I'll be joined by the President-designate, the man the government has asked to lead this huge endeavour, Alok Sharma. I'll get a sense of the extraordinary risk we face from climate change, both in the future and happening right now, with Tina Stege, who is Climate Envoy for the Marshall Islands, a Pacific nation which is one of the world's most threatened countries. We'll find out how the UK is doing from the body that marks the government's homework on hitting net zero by 2050. I'll speak to the chair of the Climate Change Committee, Lord Deben. With some of the world's most powerful leaders already negotiating at G20, we'll go live to Rome and speak to former European Commission President José Manuel Barroso. And we'll also get Labour's take on COP from Shadow International Trade Secretary Emily Thornberry. And we'll end today with an exclusive and rare interview with the Equalities Minister. I sat down with Kemi Badenoch to mark the end of Black History Month. Today we touched on trans rights and the Kathleen Stock controversy too. First though, in just a couple of hours' time, the government's point man on COP will be formally elected as president here in Glasgow. It's quite an extraordinary responsibility and must come with pressure to match, with the eyes and quite probably the hopes of the world on what happens here over the next 2 weeks. That man is Alok Sharma, and he joins me now. Good morning, President-designate. The UN says that without fresh targets on the progress we've made until now, we certainly aren't going to limit the rise in global surface temperature to 1.5. In fact, they're talking this week of a forecast of 2.7 degrees. You're going to need to get some new measures out of the next 2 weeks to hit the 1.5 target that you've talked about.
Well, Trevor, this is obviously a very big, tough ask that we've got here in Glasgow, but I think it's worth reflecting on where we've got to. So before Paris, analysts suggested that we were heading towards 6 degrees of global warming. After Paris, that temperature curve was bent downwards, under 4 degrees. And actually, if you look at the UN report that you're referring to, and of course the International Energy Agency report, that suggests that if you take all the commitments that have been made by governments, we have bent the curve towards 2 degrees. So there has been progress for the last few years, but I would say that actually the task we have here is in many ways tougher than Paris. Paris was a brilliant achievement, a historic achievement, but it was a framework agreement. What we've had to do since then is to agree some of the detailed rules, and some of the most difficult rules are still outstanding after 6 years. That makes it really challenging, and of course we know that the geopolitics is more difficult than it was at the time of Paris.
Well, let's come to some of that, but you say that we've made progress. Actually, looking at what countries have done, I think we reckon that of the 35 most important countries, only the Gambia has hit its Paris Accord agreement. Are you going to start by essentially laying down the law to the parties here that basically they haven't done what they said they would do in Paris?
Well, Trevor, you're right. I mean, this is on world leaders at the end of the day. And they made the commitments in Paris that we would limit temperature rises to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts to 1.5. And now in Glasgow, they have to deliver. You know, we've got the G20 ongoing right now, and those world leaders will arrive here tomorrow for the World Leaders Summit. And my message to them is very clear. Leave the ghosts of the past behind you. It is Halloween today, after all, but leave the ghosts of the past behind you, and let's focus on the future and unite around this one issue that we know matters for all of us, which is protecting our precious planet.
Your colleague, the Prime Minister, is not very optimistic. He said to the UN a month ago, when Kermit the Frog sang "It's Not Easy Being Green," I want you to know he was wrong. I invite you in November to celebrate what I hope will be a coming of age and to blow out the candles of a world on fire. Classic Johnson boosterism. This week, he said it's going to be very, very tough, this summit, and I'm very worried because it might go wrong. It's touch and go. It's very, very difficult. It's very far from clear that we'll get the progress that we need. What happened in the weeks in between those two statements?
Well, look, the Prime Minister is absolutely right. It is going to be really, really tough at this summit, and we've got 2 weeks to get this over the line. But he was also making the point that when we took on the presidency of COP26, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at over 80%. Almost all the G20 nations that we're talking about have got a net zero target for the middle of the century. If I had come onto this programme a year ago, Trevor, and I'd said that to you, you would have been really sceptical. So there has been progress, but there's much more to do.
But we're talking promises here, aren't we? And actually, part of what you've got to do in the next couple of weeks is arm wrestle people into some new promises. Now, it's not that helpful that President Xi, President Putin aren't turning up. I mean, basically, they're saying, honestly, we're not that bothered.
Well, if you have a look at what both President Putin and President Xi have actually announced, they both announced net zero targets for the middle of the century.
More promises. More promises. They haven't met the first lot yet.
Well, if I may, and of course, the World Leaders Summit is really important. We've got over 120 world leaders coming from, all over the globe. But of course, what we're also going to have is 2 weeks of detailed negotiations, and those teams are here. I've met with some of the representatives from Russia, from China over the last few days as I've been doing the sort of pre-prep for COP itself. And so that is what's going to be really important, is to get over the line these key negotiating issues as well. And this is a chance, quite frankly, for all of these countries to show leadership. This is the point where they have to stand up and be counted.
Do you want more out of China and Russia than they have promised?
I want more out of every country. But I think the point here is that we have made progress, and then we're going to have to take stock of where there is a gap in what the commitments are and where we need to be. And one of the things we're going to have to discuss in a very consensus-led way is how do we close that gap over this decisive decade? And, some people are suggesting we need to come back and look at those commitments again, those 2030 commitments over the next couple of years. That is an agreement that's going to come through consensus, and it's my job to help build that consensus.
What are you going to do about the Saudis and the Australians, both of whom are basically saying, fine, we'll try and do what we can, we'll plant some trees and so on, but we are absolutely not going to reduce production of oil, in Saudi's case, and Australia's case, before 2030. And that is going to stymie your aim, isn't it?
Well, both those countries have committed to net zero by the middle of the century. And of course, the pressure is on them, as it is on every country, to set out precisely how they will do that. And that's why we have been asking for countries to set out their long-term strategies for getting to net zero. The UK, as you know, in the last few days, has published its own net zero strategy, which has been welcomed by very many. It's seen as a benchmark, a global benchmark, which others can look at as well. So, my ask is of every country, come forward with the detailed policies which will deliver on the commitments that you've made.
You mentioned the UK. The Chancellor this week reduced airport duty taxes. He's made flying domestically easier. Has he apologised yet for undermining your credibility?
Well, actually, if you look at what the Chancellor has announced, he's announced very many billions of pounds of support to further our plan for a green industrial revolution.
Yeah, but he's made it easier to fly from London to Glasgow.
Let me address that issue. So domestic aviation represents less than 1% of our emissions in 2019. And remember, as a country, over the last 30 years, we've cut our emissions by over 40%. And you need to see this alongside the fact that we are investing in sustainable aviation fuels. We've got a Jet Zero program. And of course, there is an issue of connectivity where, because we are an island, you can't get that easily from one part to the other, which isn't the case for every country.
Are we going to come out of here in 2 weeks with a deal of some kind?
That is what I'm driving towards, and I think what I've always said is that what we need to come from out of Glasgow is to be able to say with credibility that we have kept 1.5 alive. And I know you've got others on this programme, and that 1.5 really matters. We know from the IPCC that we're already at global warming of 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. At 1.5, there are countries in the world that will be underwater, and that's why we need to get an agreement here on how we tackle climate change over the next decade.
Indeed, we're going to address exactly that point in a moment, but for the moment, thank you very much, Alok Sharma, President-designate of COP26.
Thank you, Trevor.
Now, for many parts of the world, climate change is not tomorrow's problem. It's a reality today. That's the case in the Pacific nation of the Marshall Islands. It's one of the first countries in the world to be severely affected. Rising sea levels are expected to put 40% of all buildings in the nation's capital, Majuro, at risk, with 96% of the city at risk of frequent flooding. I'm joined now by the country's climate envoy, Stege. Good morning, Ms. Stege.
Good morning, Trevor.
What are your expectations out of COP26? What do you want to see at the end of the 2 weeks here?
I want us to come out with an agreement that keeps 1.5 in reach. It's absolutely the line for us. If we go past it, the future is really quite unimaginable. I want to see that we have support and solidarity on particularly adaptation issues. For my country, living with 1.1 is a challenge. Living with 1.5 is going to be very painful, and we're going to need to adapt in transformative ways, and we're going to need support to do that. And so we really need to see, in addition, finance. There's got to be resources for the most vulnerable to do what needs to be done to stay a part of this global community.
When you say support, and you're talking essentially now about money, the rich countries had promised to put together a fund of, I think, $100 billion. It's not entirely clear how far they've got with this, but it doesn't sound like they've even got into double figures yet. Does that inspire much trust in you that they're taking this seriously?
I'll be really frank. It's a huge disappointment. It's very difficult when you're told that resources are being put in place and to not see that happen. There has been a plan delivered, and there's been a lot of work done to say how we will get there. And we're going to continue working with our partners to make sure that that in fact happens. But we also need to think beyond 2025. What is going to be the finance goal beyond that? And those talks start at this COP, and we need all of our partners to support us to ensure that we're going to address this problem at the scale that is required.
You said earlier on this month that you thought the key to progress actually lay not here, but in the G20. Are you hearing anything from Rome that gives you any encouragement?
We've done as much as we can do to try to send the message alongside some of our partners. My president signed a letter alongside the Prime Minister of Denmark and Ireland's leader and several others to really send the message to the G20 that, look, the major emitters, this group, you have the key. You can keep 1.5 in sight if you just put in those concrete policies and actions that we all need now in this critical decade. And I am still waiting to see what's coming out of that meeting. I've heard both some positive and some really challenging things. I think we know that this is going to be a very tough 2 weeks. And I just can't let up hope, because failure is really not an option for my country.
Bring it to life for us. What would be the consequences for your country if that 1.5 degree target isn't met?
I have to tell you, beyond 1.5 is unimaginable for my country. We are an atoll nation that sits just 2 meters above sea level. I don't know if you know what that means. 2 meters is, it's a nation of coastline. We don't even have hills, Trevor. So we're looking at sea level rise of 0.5 meters at 1.5. And as you said, that means inundations, yearly inundations. We need to start thinking about how to raise land, buildings. How are we going to survive in that 1.5 world? So beyond 1.5, we cannot go.
So the situation you're describing, in a way, suggests that if we don't fix this, in 50 years' time, what we now call the Marshall Islands as a state will be history.
I can't accept that outcome. That's not acceptable to me. And I don't think it should be acceptable to any person or nation in this world to write off a country. And what I keep telling partners is we're on the front lines. We're on the front of the front lines. We are the most vulnerable. But if you protect the most vulnerable, you protect yourself and you protect your children. And I think we've really learned, if anything, from COVID. If you protect the front line, everyone is protected.
We were speaking briefly before, and I was saying my family comes from Guyana, which is not entirely below sea level, but the most densely inhabited parts of the country lie 20 feet below below sea level. And I'm thinking, as you're speaking, that actually, if it were not for the sea wall, the school that I went to would actually be underwater. Do you think that there is actually, realistically, the possibility of protecting countries like this? Or is it just now too late?
It can't be too late. And we're working on a national adaptation plan, which we call our survival plan. And we have to have hope for our future. I'm not consigning our future to history. That's not a choice. Our choice is to work and to fight to make sure that we have safety and security for my children and for my children's children. That's going to be a different reality. It's going to be a transformed reality. We see that, but we don't accept that reality means no future.
What are you saying to Alok Sharma that success will look like for you in 2 weeks' time? What concretely do you want to see him delivering in 2 weeks' time?
We need the COP president to start us out with very high ambition at this COP. We need to have processes that make sure we understand there is a gap. How are we meeting that gap? We're not going to make 1.5 if we're not going to make it at this COP. How can we keep it on the table? That has to be our guiding star. In addition, we need to understand what are we going to do to make sure that we're looking at adaptation. How are we going to help those, the most vulnerable, like my country, to actually live in this present that we're looking at now? And we also need to see the resources that, we're going to have the finance to be able to adapt and secure our future.
Tina Stege, thank you so much indeed. No doubt we'll be talking to you again on Sky News.
Thanks so much, Trevor.
Thank you. Now, if that is a consequence of climate change happening right now, can we limit its impact, and if so, how? Well, that's what this conference is supposed to be all about, countries committing to how they're going to reduce their emissions, all with the goal of keeping global increase in average temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade since the Industrial Revolution. The United Kingdom says it will get to zero carbon emissions by 2050, and the Climate Change Committee tells us how we're getting on. Its chair, the former Environment Secretary, Lord Deben, joins me now. Good morning, Lord Deben. Good morning. How are we getting on? Do you think 1.5 degrees is actually attainable?
Yes, I do. And not only do I think it's attainable, but I very much agree with your last interviewee. It has to be attainable, because it's not just the Marshall Islands or those that would disappear were it not to be attained. But as she says, behind them are very many other communities, places like Bangladesh, which are entirely beneath the sea level, large parts of the United States and of Europe, where great cities will be losing very large sections. All that we have to defend. And it's, I'm afraid, a battle which we just have to win. It's like, in that sense, the Battle of Britain. We cannot possibly lose it.
Does the fact that we are missing some of the big players here in Glasgow, President Xi, President Putin, President Bolsonaro, is that going to make a difference to what can come out of this, this event?
Well, it'd be much better if they were there, although I'm not sure President Bolsonaro would raise the standard much. But the fact of the matter is that in the end, these countries are going to be just as affected. And I'm very interested to see that the Chinese are moving all the time, because they actually believe in climate change. They understand what huge damage it's doing to their own country. And President Xi has already made a number of steps. It's not good enough yet, but they've committed to net zero. And they've made it clear that they're not now going to support the production of coal-fired power stations outside their own land, and they are increasing the amount of, in a huge way, the amount of offshore wind and solar that they're installing. And we have to remember that their emissions are our emissions. I mean, we have exported our manufacture to China, and we are buying those goods. So this is an issue which we can't entirely shovel off to them.
The president-designate, Alok Sharma, is not a person who, let's put it this way, puts his emotions out there. But he seemed to me, talking to him a little earlier, rather frustrated by the fact that what we seem to get again and again is a lot of promises from these countries, but not always the action that he would like. How can he make sure that the next 2 weeks aren't just, in the words of Greta Thunberg, a lot of blah, blah, blah?
Well, I mean, this is one of the big problems, isn't it? The British government, I must say, and I have certainly not been a undoubted supporter of it, the British government has taken the step which everyone has to take, which is to turn its commitments into the first step of a net zero programme. And the Climate Change Committee is going to keep the government's feet to the fire. We've also made it statutory. We have to do it by law so that the government can be held to account in the courts. So we have done those things. I quite agree there are some other things we shouldn't have done, which haven't helped. But that we have done, and those are the things which we've got to see from other nations in their own way, in their own systems, but in a way which we know is really going to deliver.
Is one of the things that our government should not have done is to reduce airport taxes in order to make domestic flights less expensive?
Well, I'm afraid the government is hung up in trying to prove that leaving the European Union was a good idea. And that's quite difficult. And so one of the things it can do is to reduce the taxes internally and not across the whole of Europe. So it decides to do that. Actually, it doesn't make any difference. As a matter of technicality, because the way that internal flights are accounted for under climate change will mean that they'll just have to pay more in carbon. So it's not carbon tax. So actually, it's not going to make all that difference. But it was perhaps not the right thing to do. I think it's less important than remembering that they have increased the cost of long haul flights, and remembering also that the biggest mistake that was made was to cut our overseas aid from 0.7 to 0.5, which doesn't give people confidence that we're going to help people in the way we've promised to do. And that, for me, was a really deeply immoral and unacceptable act.
It sounds to me, Lord Deben, that what you're saying is that in spite of our own governments, I'm afraid, let's use that phrase again, blah, 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 the action that follows is at least neutral. It isn't necessarily pointing in the direction that you want the government to go in terms of improving the prospects of getting to 1.5 degrees. Essentially, what you're saying is government says it's going to do the right thing, but actually, in what it does, it's heading in the wrong direction.
No, I don't agree with that at all. I haven't said that. I've said it's made mistakes, but then every government does. This is the one government that says nothing but electric cars or the equivalent after 2030. This is the government that has an actual strategy to reach net zero and a policy and program to do it. This is the government that has made that legally binding. This is the first government to sign up to net zero in 2050. This is a government that has got a policy for building and heating in its own country, which no other government has. This is a government which is out on the front line and is doing the right things, which every now and again makes mistakes. And one of the problems with the press is that we hear very much too little of thank you for getting bits right and always concentrating on things get wrong. Now, my trouble is that I'm the chairman of the Climate Change Committee, and my job is to keep the government feet to the fire and make sure that it goes on doing the right things and avoids doing the wrong things. But it doesn't mean that I don't respect the fact that this government has committed itself in a way which no other government has, and Parliament has supported it. Whereas Joe Biden, for example, has rejoined the world in this remarkable way, but he's having terrible trouble getting his own legislature to give him the support that we need if we're going to stop the world from disaster. And disaster it is. Don't undermine this. This is a one chance we have to save the world.
I get that. And you say this is the government that's done this, this and this. Well, let's take one example, electric cars. Yep, they've made a pledge on electric cars. But I think your own committee says that we've got 26,000 charging points. We really need 450,000. Now, is there any possibility that we're actually going to hit that in time?
Well, I've been lucky enough to have an electric car, as a matter of fact, and all I can tell you is that the advance in the charging arrangements is enormous. And I have had no trouble at all using it. My problem is that we've got to move to a situation in which those cars are within the ability of everyone to buy as against petrol cars. And the biggest change...
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but one of my colleagues here at Sky did drive from London to Glasgow, and what he discovered is that 1 in 10 charging points, even of the 26,000 at any given time, isn't working. We really haven't got the infrastructure to deliver.
Well, I don't want to be put into a position of defending the government, because I'm an independent and I don't defend the government.
Okay.
And the government could do a great deal more. All I'm saying is that in the context of the world, this government has been doing a great deal. My job is to make sure that it does more and more. And on the charging front, there is a great deal more to be done, not least to making it easier to have a charge, because unfortunately they're run by different people with different mechanisms, and that's balmy. So we have to put that right. And the truth is that some motor cars have been made by people who've made better provision. And we've got to think about how we have superchargers for everybody. There are all those things that need to be done. The government is on the way to doing that. And our job is not to say you haven't done it yet. It is to say that we want more now, we want more next month, and we want more the month after. And you've got to meet the target which the Climate Change Committee has set.
Lord Deben, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you.
Now, world leaders, those that are coming, including President Biden, will gather here tomorrow. But many of the most powerful are already in Rome for the G20 meeting there. Negotiations are already well underway, and on some of the thorniest issues here at COP, along with talks on COVID and the global economy. Joining me now is the former European Commission President and the Gavi Chair, the International Vaccine Organization Chair, José Manuel Barroso. Good morning, Mr. Barroso. I wonder if we could start with COVID. We are hearing a great deal from developing countries right now that the vaccination rates are still too low, particularly in Africa. And there is a complaint that vaccines that are on the shelves in rich countries are just sitting there when they could be used in developing countries. Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, says that 100 million doses will expire that could be useful. Where are we on all of that?
We are in a situation of unacceptable inequity, in fact. There is a huge difference between the situation of vaccination in the developed world, including United States or Europe, and let's say Africa, and especially the low-income countries that are at shocking levels, low levels of vaccination. And precisely one of the goals I was expecting from this G20, and I had the pleasure to meet some weeks ago Mario Draghi, who is, as you know, Prime Minister of Italy and the current chair in office of G20, was to have some more clear determination, more ambition on putting an end to the critical phase of this pandemic. And I'm not yet sure we are going to attain that objective. That, in spite of the great efforts, I have to say, of Mario Draghi himself and the very competent Italian presidency.
That sounds extremely disappointing. I mean, are you saying that the world leaders just really can't agree to send vaccinations to places where it's needed rather than letting them expire in places where it's not needed?
The delays are due to several causes. First of all, there were and there still are export restrictions. There was also the hoarding, the accumulation of too many vaccines in the richer countries. And so there was less vaccines for poorer countries. As a chair of Gavi, I'm part of COVAX. It's the global facility for global immunization, and we have seen that. So there was priority given by manufacturers to the rich countries. So what we are now asking the rich countries is precisely to swap the line so that we can reach the smaller, the smaller economies. So that has been partly compensated. I want to be fair. These problems have been partly compensated by very generous donations, namely from the United States, also from Europe, and also by generous financing. But the reality is that we continue to have a shameful situation of unacceptable inequity. And one of the problems is precisely that when there are donations, they are given very late, so with little shelf time. It's very close to the expiry dates and without sufficient advance notice, which makes it extremely difficult from a logistical point of view, because do not forget that this is the biggest ever operation of global vaccination. We never had anything comparable in history. So it makes it very difficult to reach those that we want to reach, namely in the low-income countries.
You just used the word shameful. Others might say it's shocking that I understand all the issues and the bureaucracy and so on and so forth, but you were there during the financial crisis, and part of the point of what happened during that period was that world leaders gathered in order to cut through that sort of bureaucracy and those rules. How is it possible that when people are dying unnecessarily, that cannot happen now?
That's a very important political question, and if you want, I can compare the situation, because I was in all those G20 summits between 2008 until the end of my second mandate in the European Commission, 2014. And in fact, there was a much higher level of cooperation than today. I had that privilege of being in the first was in Washington, the second was in London with Gordon Brown precisely, the third was again in the United States with Obama. And at that time, if you want to be frank, it was unthinkable some of the world leaders not to come in person to those summits. So I'm afraid, and I'm measuring my words, I'm afraid that the current geopolitical crispation, the current geopolitical friction is having a negative impact in the global cooperation and also in the level of ambition when it comes to fight for global public goods like public health or like climate action. So, and this is a problem. I understand that we have also, because of the, let's say, tensions between the United States and China, we are watching some kind of decoupling, namely technology. And I believe personally that it's almost unavoidable. But I would not like to see that decoupling when it comes to fight for global public goods, like fighting this terrible pandemic or fighting climate change. In spite of the differences of the regimes, the political regimes, and they are serious and very profound, I think it makes sense that United States, China, Europe, Russia, India, of course, in Europe, I am also including the UK, the European Union and UK, that we all work for these global public goods. And I can tell you from experience that today the atmosphere, the political understanding and level of cooperation is clearly below what was before when we saw the financial crisis.
Well, you coupled in that answer tackling COVID and also climate change. Well, we're here at Glasgow for COP26, and your point about absent leaders, President Xi, President Putin, means that, from what you just said, we've almost already lost the battle, haven't we? Because they are not coming. They have said what they're going to do. Their net zero goals are 2060 rather than 2050 or earlier, which is what the UN thinks is needed. So actually, we are in a place where these tensions that you referred to have actually already frustrated the possibility of reaching 1.5 and rescuing places like the Marshall Islands.
I don't want to be too pessimistic. Let's see what the results are. As we know, before this summit, usually there is some lowering of expectations. Usually the compromises come very close to the end. And it's true that both President Xi and President Putin presented some reasons not to come. But I have to say, if I want to be frank, that I'm skeptic about the capacities to reach the goals that we would like to see, not only for the Glasgow COP26, but for the future. I'm skeptic because, in fact, when I compare once again with what we have done before, the European Union, for instance, at that time, the UK was part of the European Union. I can tell you that the UK was one of the leaders inside the European Union for more ambition with climate change, namely Tony Blair and other leaders afterwards. I think we have been showing real leadership there, but other parts of the world, they are not translating those commitments in legislation. So I need to see them translated in legislation. And also it is not clear how to achieve those goals. So it's not just to proclaim aspirational goals. Okay, it's better to do that than not to do it, but how to reach those goals. This is not clear. So I think the scrutiny of the results has to be in terms of commitments to legislate on those matters, but also in terms of the concrete path to reach these goals. This is the real test. Now, afterwards, in terms of language, it's not yet final, the communiqué here. I'm speaking to you from Rome. It's not. It's a good language. I mean, it's the words are there. But I think it lacks precise commitments.
Mr. Barroso, just very briefly. I mean, you're a veteran of these things. You've seen them over decades. What do you think the chances are? I don't know if you're a betting man. What do you think the chances are of getting anything meaningful out of this, as opposed to what the young activists call blah, blah, blah?
I would say 50-50, to trying to be optimistic. 50-50. I still believe it's important, and at least to make an effort. But this will take time. Let's be honest about it. It will not be solving all the problems, but I believe it's possible. And certainly we are going in the right direction, but not at the speed we need.
Mr. Barroso, thank you very much indeed for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, let's get the view from Her Majesty's loyal opposition now. Emily Thornberry is Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, and she joins me.
Good morning, Trevor.
Good morning, Ms Thornberry. Now, I don't know if you heard Alok Sharma earlier on, but he seemed rather frustrated by the run-up to COP26 and the fact that we don't really seem to be sure what's going to come out of this. How hopeful are you?
I met 500 plus delegates at St Pancras yesterday who were going to COP, and lots of young people, and they were so enthusiastic and so optimistic and so positive. I can't help that rubbing off on me. But then the politician in me stops and we look and we see, you know, we had a commitment in Paris to keep to 1.5. So we had this ambition, but we don't seem to have the plans, the backfill, you know, how are we actually going to get there? And what we need at the end of this COP meeting is for countries to have plans on the table that we can look at, that we can scrutinize, that we can hold them to account, and we can say, okay, the amount of carbon your country is producing collectively with all the other countries in the world will not take us above 1.5. And we're such a long way from that.
Mr. Barroso was rather sceptical about the reasons given by the Chinese president and the Russian president for not showing up. Are you equally sceptical, and do you think it matters?
Well, all that matters in the end is that each country has a plan to get down to net zero in a timely way. You know, getting there by 2060 is probably is too late, but I think as important as when you get to net zero is how much carbon you're producing on your way down. And you know, many countries seem to have committed to getting to net zero, but we don't really have the plans from them as to how it is that they're going to get there. And that's as important as anything else. So whether people pitch up or whether people don't pitch up, I mean, this is not a kind of, I don't know, you know, this is not just a sort of, you know, a lap of honor for countries going. I mean, there needs to be serious work. And my concern, if I'm being really honest and brutal about this, is that quite often before these summits happen, a great deal of hard work has been done. And, you know, countries have got quite a long way to the agreement before you get the final agreement at the meeting itself. And my concern is that there's still so much work to be done at Glasgow that, you know, that a particular leader turning up or not is not by itself going to make a difference.
The United Nations says that on current trends, we are not going to make it to 1.5. In fact, they talk a bit more about 2 plus and maybe even 2.7 degrees. What would a Labour government have done that the current government has not done?
Okay, right. The first thing we would have done was that we would have, as I've already alluded to, we would need to be making sure that we were doing really serious negotiations for a much longer period than this government has done, and had much more grip. We would have had to focus on it much more than we have done. I know that Alok Sharma has done his best, but frankly, it is a failure of our ability to be able to bring countries together that we haven't got more agreement before now, number one. Number two, we would be showing leadership by example. We would not be having a budget in which we were suddenly cutting taxes on internal flights. You know, we would not be cutting back on the amount of money that was available to invest in the developed world because we've cut back 0.7. And so there is not the money going into the developed world in the way that we need to. We need to be putting money into the developed world in order to help them to get to net zero, and also to help protect them against the effects of climate change, which is already happening. What else would we be doing? So we would be properly negotiating, we would be leading by example, we would be looking after the most vulnerable. We would be making sure that the action made by this government we would look to measure action by this government against the effect that it was having on biodiversity. And what were we doing? In my own brief, I have to say, just looking at what I would be doing, we have this 30 years ago, our government, as one of many, signed up to an investment charter on energy. And this investment charter was from another age, but essentially it's being used by energy companies to challenge sovereign nations who are doing their best to get to net zero. So we're seeing countries like Italy, like the Netherlands, who have a policy to get rid of carbon from their atmosphere, are being challenged by coal companies saying, you're not allowed to undermine our profits. Now,
So what do we do about that?
Needs changing, and well, that charter needs changing, and some countries are saying that they want to change it, but Britain is still sitting on the fence. So just from my own brief, it just shows that we are not really leading by example.
The rich countries said at Paris that what they try to do is to put together a fund of 100 billion. I talked a little earlier in this programme to Tina Stege from the Marshall Islands, who was very polite about it, but looked pretty hacked off about the fact that almost none of that, I mean, a very small amount of that money seems to have actually been pledged. How much should we be putting into that?
We should be putting in the amount that we promised. I mean, nations turned up at Paris, made pledges, they get the fanfare, they get the headlines, and then the money isn't available. It's the same as, developing countries are pretty hacked off when it comes to vaccines. When we make all these promises to be ensuring that they get access to vaccines, and we still haven't done that either. We're not going to be, even on the plans now, as changed, the vaccines are not going to be available to the developing world until way into next year. This is not good enough.
Brutally put, I mean, it is not your habit to agree on anything with the Prime Minister, but he has been rather gloomy this week. Brutally put, you're sort of in the same camp as he is, aren't you, that you think that we are quite a long way from getting an agreement that we need?
I would really like to see the Prime Minister use such statesmanship as he has to put all effort into Glasgow. It is not all lost, but we really do need to be serious about it. This is not a giant photo opportunity. We cannot spend our time greenwashing nations. We have to be truthful about how big a problem this is, how far we have to go, and we have to make sure that there are some serious commitments made, not just by us, but by other countries. And Boris Johnson has to summon up all statesmanship, as he has, to be able to fulfill the role of leadership which Britain needs to be doing at this time.
Emily Thornberry, thank you very much indeed. Let's turn away from COP here in Glasgow and the G20 meeting in Rome to something a bit different to finish this programme. To mark the end of Black History Month, which is today, I sat down to talk with the government Equalities Minister. Kemi Badenoch is never far from controversy in a brief that seems to attract it. She both enthuses and enrages. I spoke to her before Kathleen Stock resigned from Sussex University and the government published its proposals on so-called gay conversion therapy. Minister, this is the last day of what people call Black History Month. What have you seen this month that you liked and what have you seen that you didn't like?
I've seen a lot of very interesting sort of talks that people have given about Black history. I haven't attended them, but I know that they've been happening. And I'm really pleased that people are thinking more about Black contributions to British history. So I've liked that. What I haven't liked, maybe perhaps interventions that seem more contrived, perhaps because certain organizations feel that this is something they need to do. So they do it, but not necessarily in a way that I think is meaningful or shows that they are interested in it. And to be honest, I think Black History Month, it's become much bigger than it used to be because a lot of people are doing different things with it. It's an American import, which hasn't always fitted exactly with what I would call British and Commonwealth history. But what I'm also seeing is there's politicization happening in every sphere, and I see it happening even there, where Black History Month becomes Racism History Month, which isn't what it should be. It should be a time for us to come together and look at contributions which haven't always been taught because they are, they might be seen as very niche, or they're just not traditionally what people thought should be in the curriculum.
Is your point that what we call Black History Month is, in a sense, become White Racism History Month.
I think that's a way to put it. And I remember last year, I was absolutely horrified. I said this in a speech in Parliament. My 7-year-old came home from school and said, "We're doing Black history in this in school because every other month is White history." And I was absolutely appalled by that. That is not what it's supposed to be. Black history is British history. It's history that every Black or white person or Asian person should be interested in. It's not something specially carved out. Particularly worrying for my daughter, who is mixed race, where she is being taught that this is a special kind of history that's different for her. And I don't want her to have this sort of split identity. I think it's not helpful for people to look at communities as being so separate. We should be looking at what brings us all together.
You were reported as saying that you were less concerned about colonialism than some other people might be. Surely slavery and colonialism are pretty big mountains in the history of most Black, or many Black people in this country.
They are, but they are also one of many, many things that affect Black people across the world. And the context of that conversation was actually talking about Nigeria. It wasn't talking about this country. And if you go to Nigeria and talk about colonialism, certainly from the part I come from, I'm a Yoruba person, people will say, well, look, colonialism. And basically that means, why is colonialism my concern? And that's because the debate in that country has moved on to contemporary issues. So, yes, colonialism is a fact. It is something that happened. But you look at what's happening in Nigeria at the moment with extreme Islamic terrorism, with the value of the currency completely being decimated, the economy not doing well. There was a really interesting article in The Economist about Nigeria. Those are the things which concern Nigerians today. And as a first-generation immigrant, my family still live there. Those are the things that I'm very interested in talking about. And there's also a more important point around this, that when we focus on the things that have gone wrong in the past, certain elements, we also stop thinking about the things that make countries successful. White people don't have to talk about the Crimean War or the Suez Canal and so on. Why is it that when it comes to Black people, we are again restricted to specific topics which we need to demonstrate that we are correct or saying the right things on those things? And why is it that a debate which you can have very easily, and an opinion that is actually more popular in Nigeria, that colonialism is not the root of its problems, is something that cannot be said in the UK? I think that's an interesting question.
Well, let's look at that. Is that really true, that people would say in Nigeria now colonialism isn't, not that it doesn't matter, but it's not that big a deal? When, for example, Nigeria is itself a consequence of a colonial division of Africa.
Absolutely.
I mean, nobody in their right minds would naturally put Yoruba and Igbo in the same country.
Yes.
That was a consequence of colonialism.
Yes.
And Nigeria's more recent history is completely shaped by that. You can't really say colonialism doesn't matter, because Nigeria wouldn't exist without colonialism.
But that's not what they say. In fact, that is the biggest issue when you look at, and I'm straying into foreign affairs now, that is the country and the way it has been constituted workable? I think that's what was alluded to in that Economist article. I think we need to look at those things that do make countries well run. Looking again at free trade, looking at free markets, having very strong rule of law, property rights, all of those things. Those are the things that people should be talking about now. It's not saying that colonialism had no impact or it doesn't even have a lasting impact, but what can we do about the problems that a country faces today? And I think that's where the argument should be. And there are many other people who are having the debate about race and colonialism. I don't think that that's wrong. But why should I be forced to have their opinions? There is something changing in the way that we have debates in society now. That it isn't about different opinions, it's about allowed opinions and unallowed opinions. I'm often reading about how I'm under fire. When officials bring newspaper articles to me and it's minister under fire for saying this. Like, really? Am I under fire? I don't feel under fire. And then they show me some very angry people on Twitter who I haven't actually taken any notice of.
Black Lives Matter movement had a huge global impact. Broadly speaking, a good thing or not a good thing?
I think with the phrase Black Lives Matter, very much a good thing. We have been able to focus a lot on where there's discrimination in society or across the globe even, where there are disparities, what is causing those disparities. There's a lot of work in government, which we've been doing in order to find out what is causing differences in outcomes and what we can do about them. I think that that has been a good thing. Where it has become a vehicle for smuggling in other themes, probably less so, because many of those themes are not values which I share. But that doesn't mean that it should be stopped or banned. You know, I believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression. It's a different, it's often quite, when you look at the, you know, defund the police and other things, the people who claim to speak for that movement, those things that they put forward or they purport, I do disagree with those things. So I don't think those are good things. But in terms of focusing on how we can improve disparities and reduce prejudice and discrimination, yes.
You have responsibility for the whole Equalities brief. We've been talking about race, but of course one of the hot issues right now is trans, what people call trans rights. And that's become an issue partly because of what people can say without being contested or cancelled or whatever the right expression is. The big example recently has been that of Kathleen Stock at Sussex University, who it is thought may lose her position because she is what's called a gender-critical feminist, i.e. she believes in the biological reality of sex. Where do you stand on this?
So on Kathleen Stock, I was appalled at the way that she was treated. And in fact, I went to Sussex University and I tweeted when I saw the university statement backing her. Nobody should face bullying or harassment in the workplace. That is actually another thing that the Equality Act looks at, bullying and harassment. I don't think she should lose her job. And I think that she has every right to hold the beliefs which she does. And I think she is probably in step with the majority of the population. And what we in government are trying to do is show that we do believe that trans people should be free to live their lives as they wish. But where people see a conflict, and that conflict has tended to be around single-sex spaces and whether gender reassignment and the definition of gender reassignment and how gender-critical feminists, as they are known, believe that those rights are in conflict, what we can do in order to provide clarity. So the government position is that we will do everything we can to support trans people in particular, all LGBT people, but trans people in particular when it comes to healthcare, because they have different healthcare needs from other LGBT people. However, we do not think that that goes as far as self-ID. We do believe that there should be a process to get a gender recognition certificate rather than for people, and the process does mean involving medical professionals as well.
Some trans activists would say that the fact that you do not accept the statement that trans women are women is in itself a form of violence. You are what is called a TERF, a trans exclusionary radical feminist.
I think it's sad that the debate has turned into one of name-calling. What I would ask people to do is actually look at what the policies are, what it is we're doing in order to protect people of all types, whether they are LGBT, of different racial backgrounds, the different sexes. We are a government that believes in equality and fairness for all, and everything we're doing is to make sure that we have an equal society. And we should not get to a point where having a different opinion becomes a reason to insult other people. That's absolutely wrong.
Well, that's some kind of first for television. The government minister speaking Yoruba on air. Well, that's it from us this morning from Glasgow, but stick with us because in a moment we'll be assessing as usual what we've heard, and it's possible that in the next half hour we'll also hear live from Prince Charles. Will it be a good cop or will it be a bad cop? Who knows? Well, tell you who, probably Sam Coates, and he's going to be joining me for Trevor Phillips' The Take.